Lade will be talking to Nicolas Kynaston about the Cavaillé-Coll organ in the Parr Hall, and we'll also be hearing recordings of music by Duruflé, Samazeuilh, Roger-Ducasse, Mulet, and Joseph Jongen from a recital that Nicolas Kynaston gave there in 1973. The recordings of the complete items are in stereo, by the way, and the illustrations, played in the course of the conversation, are in mono. And now, here's John Lade to introduce the programme.
As you've just heard, Organ Gallery this week comes from the north of England, from Warrington in Cheshire. There, in the Parr Hall, is a remarkable instrument built in 1870 by the famous French organ builder Cavaillé-Coll. Originally it stood in Bracewell Hall near Skipton, the home of Mr. Hopwood of the famous music publishing firm Ascherberg, Hopwood and Krewell. In 1883, Mr. Hopwood had the organ removed to Ketton Hall in Rutland, and in the 1920s it was sold to Warrington Corporation for installation in the Parr Hall. It's still an excellent example of Cavaillé-Coll's organ building, and is a real treasure, which deserves to be cared for just as much as the Rubens in the Warrington Art Gallery. The Gothic case and console are original, and as you can hear in these few bars from Vian's Berceuse, one can easily imagine oneself in a church like Sainte Clotilde in Paris, celebrated for its Cavaillé-Coll. That was Nicolas Kynaston playing part of Vian's Berceuse on the Cavaillé-Coll organ in the Parr Hall, Warrington. We'll now move over to the Parr Hall, and the first question I put to Nicolas Kynaston was to what extent the organ as it stands today differs from the original.
It's difficult to say exactly. It looks as the original did. The case is the same, nice, beautiful French Gothic case. In fact, strange enough, though, it was made for a very different environment. It could almost have been made for this building. We don't know what Henry Willis did when he moved it here, whether he altered the voicing at all. It has been suggested that the voicing of the Montres and diapasons is slightly bigger than Cavaillé-Coll would have left them, but I think it's still very much a Cavaillé-Coll organ. The action has gone, but that was only taken away in the last renovation of 5 years ago, because they thought it was going to be too expensive to renovate it, so they electrified it then.
Well, the first aim of the Cavaillé-Colls was to make the organ more expressive. Wasn't there also a tendency to turn it into a kind of one-man orchestra?
Yes, there was that tendency, but they managed to produce a perfectly valid musical instrument, in contrast to what we did in this country in Edwardian times, when we produced something which was neither one thing nor the other, and was really in the worst of taste.
Why do you think that this was? Do you think it was because it was relatively difficult to hear orchestral music in those days during the 19th century? I mean, there were, after all, no broadcasts or gramophone records. And I read that William Spark of Leeds, who gave the first recital on this organ, I've seen a collection of his programs, and there's hardly an original organ work among them.
Yes, well, yes, that was certainly true in this country. I mean, people certainly flocked to hear their local town hall organist playing popular arrangements of popular classics. But I don't think the same thing quite applies in France. It's a very different feeling behind the whole thing. The organ is still an organ, not a one-man band. And they didn't go in for playing arrangements in the same way. The organ evolved along with the rather orchestral style of composition But I wouldn't even give the music that name. It's something that's crept in. I don't really think it is orchestral. It's called the symphonic organ, and the symphonic organ style of, Guillemot, Franck, Vidor. And they wrote so-called organ symphonies. But they're not in bad taste in any way, in the way that a lot of the orchestral arrangements which were performed in this country were in bad taste.
Yes, I think the organ was much more concerned with the church in France than it is here, or it was here.
Yes.
How would you find this organ for playing Bach?
Well, I have played Bach here. It's possible. It's obviously not easy, but on the other hand, it's easier to play Bach on this than to play César Franck, say, on a modern two-manual trekker.
In a few moments we shall come to hear your recital, but before that I'd just like to ask you whether you chose the music for your program, which is all French. I know Jongen was a Belgian, but from the Walloon district. Did you choose this because it suits this organ better than any other?
Well, yes, I did indeed. And also, this program was all of music which was composed with exactly this sort of organ in mind.
You're giving a recital here on May the 18th, that's next Tuesday. Are you going to confine yourself to French music, or will you make a wider choice for your program?
No, not entirely French, but leaning very heavily towards the French.
This organ has this marvellous French sound, and don't you think it's something that ought to be preserved?
Indeed I do. I think it's probably one of the most important things in this town, and I think it should be preserved above anything.
Coming to more fundamental things, do you mind just giving us a brief account of the organ, how many manuals there are and so on? And this is obviously the original console. It's reversed in the French style, and it's very nostalgic to see the nameplate.
Yes, it's a beautiful nameplate. It's gold on a, I suppose, mahogany. Is it mahogany background? And it's three manuals, the bottom manual being the great, the second the positive, and the top one the récit. The ventral pedals are all still here. In fact, that's one of the things I'm slightly doubtful about, because there seem to be more ventral pedals than there should be. They're so close together that you can't press them down without pressing two together, which I'm sure Cavaillé-Coll wouldn't have done. It's still a straight pedal board and flat. The specification is so similar to César Franck's own organ at Saint-Clotilde that it's amazing, which is why it's such a particular pleasure to play Franck here.
But looking down, there are two larger pedals on either side, and of course the two swell pedals in the middle.
Yes.
What are those two on the outside?
Well, this one on the very far left is the great sub-octave, which Cavaillé-Coll always put on his larger instruments, and is very useful, especially for the endings of the big Franck pieces, big Vienne pieces, because they're always very high up in the keyboard, and to have the great sub-octave adds that tremendous body to it. And the one on the very far right is the great reeds off ventral.
At this point, I asked Nicolas Kynaston if he could tell us something about the special characteristics of this organ in Parr Hall, the ones which he considered most interesting. So he started by illustrating the full ensemble at the beginning of Vidor's Symphony No. 6. what's coming next?
Strings. The French strings, I always feel, are so much... Well, I don't know how to describe it. If I said so much more subtle, I'd probably offend so many English people, but so much more subtle for Vidor in particular, which on an English organ with very lush strings can sound sentimental. But with these rather keen strings, or not keen, edgy, characterful strings, you don't get the feeling of sentimentality.
You said just now that this organ very closely resembled the original Sainte Clotilde organ.
Yes.
I wonder, could we hear just a bit of César Franck?
Yes, indeed, I'd love to.
Another special characteristic of the French organ, which you showed me just now, was the voix humaine, the vox humana.
Yes, indeed. And that is, I think, one of the stops which we have been least successful with in this country. I mean, it's an old joke that the vox humana really does sound like a bleating goat in most English organs. I mean, there have been excellent ones, but in general, it's a rather poor imitation. And so people, when they're playing César Franck, for example, are rather apt to substitute Celeste instead. But I feel rather strongly that's very wrong, because it's such a special tone colour, and if he asked for it, then he obviously wanted it, and we really should stick to it.
Yes, well, I think it's something we don't understand properly in this country, because it was always a stop that turned up on one's great aunt's harmonium, the vox humana.
Yes, a joke stop it became, when really it's a very noble voice in its own way.
Just two more things I'd like to ask you to play, or let us hear. One is the solo trumpet,
Oh, yes.
which again sounds completely different from an English solo trumpet.
Yes, it does indeed. Shall I illustrate that with a bit of César Franck again?
Which chorale is this?
The third one again from the middle section.
It's really curious how different that is from the Purcell trumpet tune and
Yes.
John Stanley trumpet tunes and so on.
Different character.
Well, the other thing I'd like to hear, underneath you've got a curious thing called effet de l'orage,
Yes.
the storm. And I remember when I was a boy, organ recitals so often ended with a storm. There was a man called Arthur Meal who used to come to Tunbridge Wells where I lived and played an absolutely incredible piece. And he used to keep his foot down on the two lowest semitones of the pedal board almost all the way through. But you've got it here, you've got this effect of the storm. I think it sounds very much like the other one, but still.
Yes, it does. Sounds like for somebody falling all over the pedals.
Yes. Well, now I think it's time for more extended music. We're going to begin with the Scherzo Opus 2 by Maurice Duruflé, the organist of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont in Paris. It's dedicated, I see, to Charles Tournemire, who was the organist of Sainte Clotilde, where he was next but one successor to César Franck. Piano came in between, I think. And, of course, the organ there is the famous Cavaillé-Coll, which we've already been talking about. And so there's a strong family link in playing the piece here. Did you find it worked well?
Yes, worked very well indeed. Duruflé was also Tournemire's assistant for some time. And so, I mean, he was absolutely steeped in the Sainte Clotilde tradition one way or another.
That was the Scherzo, Opus 2 by Duruflé. Well, I don't know if I'm right, but it seems to me that a great many French composers have had a go at writing for the organ who are not generally associated with it. Gustave Samazeuilh, for example, I associate more with writing about music than composing. Yet here we have a prelude by Samazeuilh, though I see that the registration is by Joseph Bonnet, the famous organist of Saint-Eustache, which suggests that Samazeuilh may not have been absolutely au fait with organ registration, although he was a pupil of Dandy, who in turn was a pupil of Franck. Can you tell us something about this piece?
Very little, actually, but it's something of a rarity, which I just happened to come across. The particular link I was thinking of was that both Duruflé and Samazeuilh were pupils of Paul Dukas, and I thought that was a point of slight interest there.
Prélude by Gustave Samazeuilh. The next piece is a fine one and well known, the Pastorale by Roger-Ducasse. He came from Bordeaux and was a pupil of Fauré. The title Pastorale suggests something very simple, but this piece is often quite dramatic, though of course it has the familiar lilting rhythm of the traditional pastorale. This organ, I think, must provide you with all the sort of authentic colours for it.
Yes, it does indeed. It certainly does. Once again, there was a link here, because, as I said, Duruflé and Samazeuilh were pupils of Paul Dukas, and Roger-Ducasse succeeded Dukas as the professor of composition at Paris Conservatoire in 1935. The piece is very fascinating because it's practically an orgy of canonic ingenuity, and it was first performed by Guillemot.
Pastorale by Roger-Ducasse. Another organist who clearly composed with Cavaillé-Coll in mind was Henri Mulet, and I was especially interested in this next piece from Mulet's suite of 10 pieces, Byzantine Sketches. One usually hears only the last of these, the Tues Petra, but you've chosen number 3, Rosace, Rose Window, I suppose. Why did you choose this one?
Because it's so unusual. It's such a very simple and yet subtle piece, and very evocative, as you say, of the Rose Window. And once again, I chose it because there's a slightly tenuous link here. Mulet's teacher was Gilman. So we're keeping it all in the family, so to speak.
Yes, why do you think it's evocative of the Rose Window?
It's difficult to express oneself without sort of strings of cliches and things, but he starts off with these descending 6 very softly on 8 and 4 foot flutes. And then later on in the middle of the piece, it becomes slightly more animated, and he adds a 2 foot and a 16 foot, and it's very high up on the keyboard. And, well, sort of sunlight coming through stained glass and reflecting on mosaic is very much the impression of, and highly perfumed with incense and all the other 19th century things.
Can we just have a preview of that, do you think?
Yes.
And now here's the complete piece. Rosace by Henri Mulet. I always feel the composer of your last piece is rather neglected as a composer for the organ, the Belgian Joseph Jongen, who for many years was director of the Conservatoire in Brussels. This D-flat toccata is quite a late piece. It dates from 1937. Do you think Jongen had a Cavaillé-Coll instrument in mind? I believe there was one in the concert hall of the Conservatoire in Brussels. I'm speaking off the cuff about that.
That one I didn't know about. There's certainly one in St. Nicholas's Church in Ghent, which he might have known. But I mean, there are other organs in Belgium which are very much in the same style. The one in Antwerp Cathedral, for example, is very much in the Cavaillé-Coll style.
So can we hear the D-flat toccata now?
Yes.
Toccata in D-flat by Jongen was played by Nicolas Kynaston on the Cavaillé-Coll organ in the Parr Hall, Warrington. You also heard Nicolas Kynaston in conversation with John Lade, who produced the programme.